Thank you, and good afternoon, and my thanks to Chong and Lars Berger for arranging this. I think it is not only an important topic, but also what we all should be doing, which is to engage in the very different experiences in our different regions and kind of use that comparative insight to perhaps get a little bit more wise on what future security challenges bring and how we can avoid these challenges turning into large-scale confrontation. Because I think indeed that is going to be one of the main challenges for the beginning of the 21st century, whether we can avoid major great power war, whether that end of history, if you want to use that term, which followed the end of the Cold War is something which is going to continue, or whether history in its Hegelian version is going to revisit us in large-scale confrontation. And for that reason, I would like to talk about risk and reason, Nordic approaches to stability and security. And if I may focus on risks first and then go to reason afterwards. When you look at the Nordic region, it's very easy to think of this as a place without border controls, where people live nice, cozy lives with a standard of living which on a global scale is very high indeed, and that this is basically a region of peace. And in many ways it has been so, but perhaps mostly in our story about that region. Because if you look back just a little bit, you would find that this has been a region where Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes has been fighting each other extensively throughout history. At some point we stopped, mostly because we were so fed up with the fact, and the Swedes won, but also because suddenly that region was no longer as a security region in and of itself, but became part of a larger European story of security and geopolitics. So what have been the story about the northern region is that it has been dominated in the beginning of the 20th century by Germany and later on by the Soviet Union and Russia, and it was in the shadow of that threat that most of the foreign policy of the nations involved played out. So actually there was a very great risk for war and confrontation, and during the Second World War that actually ended up in a large part of the region either being involved in fighting on the Eastern Front or being occupied by Germany. And during the Cold War, the region was in fact one of those regions in Europe where NATO expected a large-scale nuclear confrontation to take place if ever war was going to play out. And the story we tell ourselves about the development of the Nordic welfare state and so on completely ignores the fact that those welfare states were evolved on the basis of a large-scale investment in security and military, which was supposed to guarantee that peaceful development. Even if Sweden was the most vocal of neutral countries, by the end of the Second World War, Sweden had the third largest air force in Europe. So the way you should guarantee your peace was very much funded in your willingness to prepare for war. And at present, the Baltic region is again one of the regions in Europe where if a confrontation between NATO and Russia were to play out, that would perhaps be the most likely place for this confrontation to play out, with a confrontation between NATO and Russia in the Baltic countries, with the Baltic Sea being a major part in NATO defense planning, for how to relieve the Baltic countries, but also for how to influence, if you want to use that word, Russian decision-making in a way to deter Russia from going ahead with an attack on the West. And you would find across the board an increase in defense budgets in the region. So actually, that peaceful story is very much, and still is very much, part of a story of a region trying to live with the risks of a dangerous geopolitical situation where large-scale neighbors can play a geopolitical games with the fate of smaller nations. So that is the risk, a risk which is inherent, if sometimes not as pointed to or as vocalized part of the story of the Nordic region. But I think one of the reasons why we don't talk so much about it is the very reasonableness of Scandinavians and the Nordic regions as such. So let's turn to reason. When Barack Obama was in his final year as US president, he invited the Nordic leaders to Washington to have a summit where he lectured them on the Nordic model, which some of them liked more than others. But part of Obama's point was that he would have wished that all nations were like the Nordic. And what did he mean by that? He meant that if only people were so reasonable that they could if he could meet with the leaders of various other nations and they would be reasonable in their demands to the US president and argue their case carefully to live up to all the standards of a Chicago law professor, then his job would have been much more easy. And that is, of course, also a way we would like to see ourselves in the Nordic region, that we are pragmatic, that we adhere to arguments, and even if our case is not that strong, then we would listen to the other side's argument, and if that indeed is a better and stronger argument, we will deal with it. And that is, of course, also when you look at Nordic cooperation, a very strong feature of that, because even though the Nordic countries has very different foreign and security policies, and very different national interests, and very different geopolitical situations, they are actually able in the Nordic Council of Ministers, and sometimes even in the run-up to UN or EU meetings, to get some kind of coherent policy going, simply by the virtue of political cultures where argument is important. So the way the Nordics have been able to live with those risks I sketched before is by their very reasonable nature, by their ability to have a reasonable discussion and be able to look at themselves from the outside and see what the Nordic position in the world were and how that would fit into a larger argument. In that sense, you might argue, as the pro-rector just did, that it is a very large part not only of our university education, but also of our foreign policy to be in a problem-solving mode. To try to identify the issues, try to deal with them, and try to isolate them. The weakness of this is that we sometimes underestimate the passions which also shape policy. And we sometimes have difficulties in understanding a President Putin because he basically doesn't really operate on a Nordic model. But on the other hand, it also means that you will always find people from the Nordic countries in the United Nations. You will always find people from the Nordic countries talking among themselves, and anyone else who will care to listen, on how to get into a coherent problem-solving mode to deal with various conflicts. And in many ways, I think that is a Nordic legacy of which we should be proud, something which indeed is very much part of the Nordic approach to international relations as it is carried out, as well as it is studied. And I would also think that approach to live in a world of great risks, but also to have a coherent and open discussion about them, is something which perhaps we could contribute to discussions on the risks of the future security environment of Asia, but also something which we could perhaps contribute to the way international relations and similar subjects like security studies are taught at Fudan and elsewhere. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to the continued discussion.